its second reading. Thank you.
Well said. Well done. Good speech.
I call Porter Williams.
Firstly, I just want to pull the member from ACT up on a matter of geology that that he doesn't realise, sir, that in a volcanic region like Auckland, when the volcanoes explode, it will have an impact on the land. And I would actually recommend to the member from ACT that what he should do is go to where the children of Auckland go to find out about geology and volcanology, and that's the museum at the Domain. They have a very good exhibit there they have a very good exhibit there that actually shows you the impacts of a volcano exploding on the buildings. So there are lots of buildings in Auckland. There are lots of buildings in Auckland that will be impacted if one of the many volcanoes, and let's face it, there's what, 7, 9 volcanoes in Auckland, happens to explode. However, we're here to talk about the Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill, and as the previous speaker discussed, it is around amending the Building Act to ensure that we deal with earthquake-prone buildings as a result of what's happened at the earthquake sequence in Canterbury. There are some timeframes in which to put that in place, and also there's some definitions around risk and what types of buildings that will be covered. This bill will have a huge impact on the territorial authorities, there's no doubt about that, but there are some specific issues I want to deal with. We know, Mr Speaker, that it's impracticable to deal with all the buildings. However, this bill actually excludes particular buildings such as farm buildings, retaining walls and other such structures which won't pose a risk to human life should they come down in an earthquake. We know also, Mr Speaker, that there are some things that are not covered in this bill that actually were impacted in the Canterbury earthquake sequence. One of the things that I really hope that does get covered off is poor engineering. We know that with the CTV building, for example, that no one has really has taken responsibility for the poor engineering that caused the deaths to all those people in that particular building. That was really a failure of engineering, and I don't believe that we can really continue without actually having some way of determining who to hold responsible for that. I would hope that this bill actually takes account of that. There are some priority buildings that are included in this bill. Hospital and emergency facilities, of course, certain educational facilities, parts of buildings that are reinforced, such as parapets, and that could fall in an earthquake. And actually, some of these did fall, and some of these did cause deaths in the earthquake sequence, particularly in the February 22nd quake. There are some issues that aren't addressed in here that we are fully cognizant in Canterbury, Mr Speaker, and that is things such as the risks that become apparent from building materials once buildings either come down or demolish. And I'm speaking specifically about the risk of asbestos, which is quite a risk when we are demolishing buildings. But Mr Speaker, what I want to do particularly is I want to honour a particular person for whom, if this bill was in place and if our territorial authority had enacted what they should do and assessed buildings and assessed this particular building as being risky, then she would not have died. And that is Mrs Maureen Valerie Fletcher. Mrs Fletcher is the mother and mother-in-law of very dear friends of mine, and she was 74 when she passed away when a veranda of a cafe that she was having a cup of tea at collapsed on top of her during the earthquakes. What is particularly sad about Mrs. Fletcher's case is that she was unidentified for a couple of weeks. There were 2 weeks in which her family had not heard from her, and they had no idea that she had actually perished. What had happened was her body was taken out of the building where she died, but it was misidentified. And there was a family in Christchurch who thought their mother had passed away, and there was a family, my friends in Auckland, who had no idea that their mother had passed away. So for 2 weeks, my friends were perplexed about what had happened to their mother. They travelled to Christchurch, spent a lot of time on the ground, spent a lot of time with the emergency services trying to identify what had happened. When the misidentification actually did, the mistaken identification did actually come to light, of course that meant that another family realised that their loved one was safe, and actually in a rest home in Auckland. And my friends, of course, realised that their mother had passed away. This is why I bring this up, is that this bill is about saving lives. If this bill had been in place, if the Christchurch City Council had been able to assess their buildings and assess that building with the veranda as unsafe, Mrs. Maureen Valerie Fletcher might not have died. That's what this bill is about, Mr. Seymour. It's about ensuring that no one else is put at risk, because we can do something about that. It's about ensuring, don't shake your head, Mr. Seymour, it's about ensuring that there are no further families that have to go through the ordeal that the Fletchers had to go through while they waited to see where their mother was. It is not something to shake your head about, Mr. Seymour. This impacted 187 families directly who lost people in Canterbury, but it impacted the whole country. And even as recently as a couple of hours ago, we are still experiencing aftershocks in Canterbury. Every time an aftershock or a major quake, or we had a 5.7 on Valentine's Day, what does that do to the structures that are already weakened by the severe force that have been impacted upon them? This is not a laughing matter, Mr. Seymour, and it's not. It is an absolute responsibility of this government and of the territorial authorities, the councils around this country, to make sure they get it right, so that people in Auckland, in Wellington, in Tauranga don't have to go through the same kinds of dreadful things that have happened to the people of Canterbury. We do not wish that upon anyone, especially the people in Epsom, if they're represented by someone who is as uncaring as you in relation to. We can do something about this, and we should. Mr. Speaker, I'm getting quite emotional about this because people did lose their lives. This is a bill that will actually impact on the lives of people and ensure that they don't have to suffer the way 187 families have had to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.